The most important thing we can do, one of the most important things we can do to extend our lifespan is to keep our glucose and insulin levels as low as possible. The reason for that is glucose, when levels are higher in the blood, we undergo a rate of glycation much faster than we normally would. And what is glycation? Glycation is simply the attachment of sugar to our protein molecules. 99% of our cellular function is carried out by proteins. Our proteins are absolutely critical to normal life processes within the cell. Well, proteins are very efficient molecules. They're very slippery, long-chain polypeptide molecules that are constantly mingling in the soup inside the cell, or the cytoplasm. As they mingle, they bump into one another, they roll around one another, they bounce off one another, and they still get their jobs done. Primarily because they're very slippery. If you ever tried to play catch with a raw oyster, you know what I'm talking about. Well, if you wanted to play catch with an oyster, how would you make that oyster sticky? Well, one thing you could do is put some molasses on it and put it in the oven for a few minutes. What you're doing is you're sugaring it. You're glycating it, the process of glycation. And that will make the oyster sticky and easy to grab onto. Well, all of us are glycating 100% of the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a normal, natural process, yet it's a detrimental process to life. And therefore we want to glycate as little as possible. Since glycation is a passive process of the attachment of sugar to protein molecules, it stands to reason that the higher the blood sugar, the more we're going to glycate. The more sugar that the proteins are exposed to, the more they will attach to. So the higher the blood sugar, the more we glycate. Now, when proteins are glycated, they become sticky. They start to stick together within the cell, and they work much less efficiently. That starts to lead to cellular dysfunction, inflammation, tissue inflammation, and it starts the process of degenerative disease. Things like atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, early heart attacks and strokes, inflammatory diseases, basically poor health that leads to degenerative disease. Now, what's wrong with degenerative disease? Well, obviously there are problems with degenerative disease, but our longevity is dependent on nothing else at this stage of medicine where we are now than the prevention of degenerative disease. People don't die of old age. People die of degenerative disease. A 99-year-old lady who doesn't wake up in the nursing home one morning didn't die of old age. She died of a disease. She probably ruptured an aneurysm during the night, or she had a heart attack, or a fatal cardiac arrhythmia, something related to years of accumulation of degeneration, partly based on excess glycation and oxidative stress. So we get less glycation, and since glycation in causing proteins to stick together leads to oxidative stress, we age faster when we have high sugar levels. The other issue is high sugar levels lead to high insulin levels. As blood sugar goes up, we have to move that sugar from the blood into the cell. That's done by a hormone called insulin. The higher the blood sugar level, the more insulin we have to make. As insulin levels rise in the bloodstream, insulin also leads to degenerative disease because high insulin levels also cause oxidative stress. If you look at the adult onset diabetic, they are a model for rapid aging because they have both high blood sugar and high insulin levels. And long before the rest of us non-diabetics get these diseases, they get diseases such as atherosclerosis, abnormal cholesterol profile, high blood pressure, central accumulation of body fat or central obesity, peripheral neuropathy, kidney disease, and retinal disease, which can lead to blindness. So, even as non-diabetics, we can slow down the aging process and extend our productive, useful lifespan by keeping sugar and insulin levels as low as possible. Follow me?
The diabetic has to take insulin. Does that increase the chance for disease?
It does. It's an unfortunate situation, but what happens with a diabetic is he has insulin resistance, the adult onset diabetic. He's had high sugar for so long and high insulin levels for so long that his cells no longer respond to the insulin as efficiently as they should. It's very much like if you had to live next to the railroad tracks and you heard the train day in and day out. Eventually you'd tune the train out and your friends would come over and say, "My God, what's that noise?" And you'd say, "What noise?" Well, when we have constant high insulin levels, our cells begin to pull in their receptors to insulin, and they stop responding to insulin, or they decrease their response to insulin. So we develop a problem called insulin resistance. Now this happens in diabetics and non-diabetics. The difference is, in order to develop adult onset diabetes, your insulin resistance increases and increases and increases to the point that your pancreas can't make enough insulin to compensate for it. As we become more insulin resistant, the pancreas reacts by making more insulin. So higher insulin levels then are necessary to get the cells to pull sugar in from the blood into the cell. As that insulin level gets higher and higher, we get more and more insulin resistant. So the pancreas compensates by making more and more insulin. At some point, the pancreas can't make any more insulin. So you have high sugar, very high insulin, and now you develop insulin resistance, so the insulin you have isn't enough to bring the sugar from the blood into the cell, and the sugar levels go too high, and now you're a diabetic. Okay?
Oh, I'm hearing that my biggest enemy, at least on the outside, is sugar.
Exactly. But it's not only sugar. You're going to find that there are a large number of foods that increase blood sugar rapidly and dramatically that aren't even sweet. And that's part of the keys to this little lesson here, is to learn what foods those are. Because you can not eat sweets and still run very high blood sugars by virtue of eating a lot of high glycemic foods. And we'll get into that too. Just to summarize briefly, one of the main keys to longevity is keeping glucose and insulin levels low by the result of preventing degenerative disease. Now, when we talk about sugar and insulin levels, there are 3 foods on the planet to eat: proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. When we talk about glucose and insulin, we're talking primarily about carbohydrates, because proteins and fats, relatively speaking, have very little effect on blood sugar. Now, carbohydrates come in various forms, and not all carbohydrates are created equal. No matter what carbohydrate you eat, however, it's absorbed into the blood as glucose or sugar. That's true if you eat a bowl of sugar or if you eat a bowl of broccoli. The difference is how quickly that happens. If you eat a bowl of sugar, it happens instantly. Before you even swallow the sugar, your blood sugar is going up because it's absorbed from your mouth, from under your tongue. Very rapidly, your sugar levels go way up, and that requires the pancreas to make a large amount of insulin. If you eat a bowl of broccoli, it has to be digested, the cellulose has to be broken down, the digestible carbohydrate has to be separated from the non-digestible fiber, and it's a long, slow process. Blood sugar goes up very slowly and gradually over about 2 hours, which allows insulin levels to climb very slowly and gradually over about 2 hours. Tremendous difference in the health consequences. Okay, one is causing high blood sugar, high insulin, rapid glycation, excess glycation, high insulin levels, more oxidative stress, more degenerative disease, day after day, week after week, year after year. Probably makes a difference of about 10 to 15 years in lifespan between the person, non-diabetics now, who eats a poor diet and doesn't exercise versus the person that eats a low glycemic diet and exercises. That's just my opinion. I don't have data to back that 10 or 15 years statement up, but I feel very strongly about it. You with me so far?
Sure am.
Okay. So now we want to talk about what insulin is and what it does. I talked about the consequences of high insulin. Insulin is our fuel injector. When we eat carbohydrates, we put the carbohydrates into our gastrointestinal system, absorb it into the bloodstream, and the sugar does us no good in the bloodstream. It's useless. In order to burn that sugar for fuel, we need to get it into our cells. Very much like when you put gasoline in your car, you put it in the tank. It doesn't push the car until you get it into the cylinder. So you have a fuel injector to move the gas from the tank into the cylinder where it combusts to move the car. Insulin is our fuel injector. It moves sugar from the blood into the cell where we actually combust it. We send it down a chain of reactions to burn it, so to speak, and extract the energy. Now, let's look at a cell and look at how insulin affects the cell. Here's a cell with its insulin receptor. All cells have receptor sites that proteins, hormones, and other molecules, even drugs, can hook onto to affect the cell. So here's a cell. Here's a blood vessel going by. And that blood vessel has glucose in it. It has blood, and there's sugar in the blood in the form of glucose. Here's an insulin molecule. Now, what insulin does, it attaches to the receptor site, and insulin is now affecting the cell. The first thing it does is it opens up a channel to bring glucose into the cell. So the glucose enters the cell, and now it's sent down a chain of reactions to extract the energy, to burn it, so to speak. And if this is a kidney cell, it uses that energy to do kidney things. Liver cell, liver things. If it's a muscle cell, it uses it to contract. Okay? If it's a fat cell, it doesn't burn the sugar. It converts it to fat, because that's its job. Fat cell is an energy storage depot, and its job is to take the energy from glucose, convert it to fat, and store it for a rainy day. So, what it does is it converts that glucose to fat, packs it up against the wall to make room for more. Now, in between meals, when sugar is low, we're supposed to move that fat back into the blood to restore the energy available to our other cells. So what we'll do is we'll turn that fat into a little tiny product, a molecule called free fatty acids, which are then delivered back into the bloodstream as energy molecules that our other cells, kidney cells, liver cells, muscle cells, can pick up and burn for energy, just like they would burn sugar. Different metabolic pathway, but energy nonetheless. With me? Okay. So, unfortunately, the other effect that insulin has on our cells is to block this process of converting fat to free fatty acids. So insulin prevents us from utilizing our body fat. Now, why would we have a hormone that would block that very important process? Because insulin is balanced with other hormones that promote fat burning, that promote fat breakdown, particularly glucagon, but also growth hormone and male hormones like testosterone promote fat burning. So the problem with this is, between meals, if our insulin levels are still high, we can't get at our body fat, and we become tired, weak, and hungry. And if you're a typical red-blooded American, you eat more, right? So the problem begets more of the same problem. Let's look at how this scenario affects your day. We'll put a graph here of blood glucose and insulin levels versus time of day. And here we'll have a meal. Now, let's say this is breakfast, and for breakfast we're going to have a bowl of cereal with a banana, a cup of sweetened blueberry yogurt, a glass of orange juice, a cup of coffee. Okay? That's what I would call a high glycemic breakfast. Typical American breakfast considered healthy, very high glycemic. The result of that is for blood glucose levels, or blood sugar levels, glucose and sugar are synonymous, go screaming up. Okay? That requires the pancreas to make a whole bunch of insulin, because too much sugar in the blood will make us sick. We've got to move that sugar from the blood into the cells, and that's insulin's job, our fuel injector. So the pancreas makes a whole bunch of insulin, and insulin levels go screaming up. Now we've got high insulin and high glucose. All of a sudden, all our cells open these channels for sugar because of the tremendous insulin effect, and all the glucose rushes into the cells. The result? The blood glucose plummets because the sugar's moved into the cells. So at this point, the pancreas can say, well, I can take a break. The blood sugar's down. I can stop making insulin. But insulin is a long-chain polypeptide hormone. It doesn't go away quickly. It has to be metabolized, and its levels in the blood drop very slowly. So insulin levels drop more on this curve. Okay? So at this point in time, we have low sugar, normal low, not too low, not pathologic, and high insulin. The problem with that is, at the time when we have very little sugar left in the bloodstream, insulin is still around, it's still attached to our fat cells, and we can't break down fat into free fatty acids. We can't release any energy into the blood. Okay? Our fat is a battery. Okay? It takes in sugar, stores the energy as fat, and when we need it, it releases the energy. But with insulin present between meals and relatively low sugar, we're stuck. We can't release fat. We can't get any energy. So we're tired and hungry. So if you're a good red-blooded American, you have a donut and a cup of coffee, right? And what does that do? Sends the blood sugar screaming up. Or maybe you have rice cakes in your drawer like a lot of secretaries do, the all-American diet food, very high glycemic, tremendous effect on blood sugar. So blood sugar levels go screaming up. The pancreas says, oh, I'm back on. I have to make more insulin to take care of that blood sugar. So insulin levels go up. There you are again. High sugar, high insulin. All our cells open their channels. Sugar rushes from the blood to the cells. Level of sugar in the blood once again plummets. Pancreas can take a break, stops making insulin. Insulin levels drop slowly once again. There you are again. Low sugar, high insulin. Very little energy from your blood sugar. High insulin, blocking fat burning, unable to get energy from your battery. So what do? Maybe now it's lunchtime. So you go for a plate of pasta, half a loaf of bread, iced tea with sugar. Up goes the blood sugar. Back up goes the insulin. Now you can see how your day is unfolding. So you get these big swings in sugar. Insulin never quite comes down, because every time it starts to come down, you're tired and hungry from low sugar and high insulin, and you're forced to eat again, or you're tempted to eat again. Now, there are several problems with this. Number one, you've got these big swings in energy that can really wreck your day. Mid-morning, loss of productivity, have to eat something. Mid-afternoon, put the head down on the desk and fall asleep for 10 minutes, you know. But worse than that, when your blood sugar basically goes above this line, which is all this time, all this time, and all this time, you're glycating at a much faster rate. Remember glycation, the attachment of sugar to protein, inflammation, cellular damage, degenerative disease. So you're promoting degenerative disease at a much faster rate than you would be if your blood sugar were down here. Also, your insulin levels, by virtue of never coming down, are also increasing oxidative stress and promoting degenerative disease. Remember, high insulin levels are associated with central obesity, high blood pressure, abnormal cholesterol profile, atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries, early heart attacks and strokes, and possibly a number of other diseases. So what we really want to do is behave in a way or eat in a way that we can keep our blood sugar very low and our insulin very low. So let's change the day. Let's say instead of the cereal and yogurt breakfast, we had a 4-egg omelet with a couple slices of low-fat cheese or non-fat cheese and a bunch of chopped vegetables. Put a little olive oil on it. Okay? Sound all right?
Sounds great.
What happens is your blood sugar, instead of doing this, it does this. Okay? Now, your pancreas no longer has to make this much insulin. It only has to do this with the insulin. Okay? The relatively low level of insulin causes just some of our channels to open up to sugar. So there's a gradual flow of sugar from the blood into the cell, which allows the blood sugar to drop slowly, which parallels the curve by which insulin drops, allowing insulin time to catch up. When they bottom out together, at the time of day when we're getting very little energy from our sugar, our insulin level is low. So we don't have insulin here at the fat cell. We're free to break down fat into free fatty acids and deliver those free fatty acids into the blood. What happens? We have plenty of energy, we're more productive, we're not hungry, we don't think about snacking. We get some more work done in the morning, and a little bit later on, we go to lunch, we have a piece of chicken and a salad. Okay, blood sugar does this again. Insulin level, again, doesn't have to go screaming up, it only has to parallel the blood sugar. A relatively low level of insulin allows the sugar to drop slowly, allowing the insulin time to catch up. Once again, they bottom out together. There's no insulin at the fat cell between meals, and we're able to release body fat into free fatty acids. And our kidney and liver and muscle cells have plenty of energy to live on. So once again, we're not tired or hungry. We have a productive afternoon. And we go home that evening and we have a nice piece of salmon and a couple servings of broccoli and we do it again. So in the evening, with this same scenario of no insulin around, we're not hungry and we don't snack. We have much less tendency to snack in the evening. So we go to bed with low blood sugar, low insulin, which allows us to burn fat all night long while we're sleeping. So you wake up in the morning, your pants fit a little better, you feel good, and you make another omelet. More important than losing weight, which is a wonderful thing, is at this level of glucose and insulin, you're glycating very slowly, and your insulin levels are low, so your insulin is not promoting the level of degenerative disease that it promoted up here. And you probably live 10 or 15 years longer. Now, we're not just expanding the last 10 or 15 years of life so you can make it in a nursing home another 5 years. We're extending your productive years, your healthy years, because we're preventing disease. With me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, now that you understand it, what we need to do now is basically give you a list of foods that do this, and by eliminating those foods from your universe, you can basically live down here. Basically, we've got all sweets, I'm sorry to tell you, all starches, which include everything from grains, bread, rice, also potatoes, pasta, cereal, chips, crackers, and similar snack foods. There are only 3 vegetables on the list: corn, beets, and carrots. Corn is a starchy vegetable. Beets and carrots are rather sweet. If you've ever had carrot juice, it's almost as sweet as soda pop.
It's very sweet.
Yeah, high in sugar. Now, there are lots of fruits that aren't on this list, so don't let the large list of fruits scare you too much. The fruits you should avoid: bananas, kiwi, pineapple, papaya, mangoes, all types of melon, cantaloupe, honeydew, watermelon, dried fruits, like, well, any dried fruits really except apricots, particularly raisins, are high glycemic. Apricots are the one exception because they're so low in sugar to begin with. All fruit juice should be avoided. Now, there are lots of fruits that are not on this list, just so you don't panic: apples, oranges, peaches, nectarines, tangerines, plums, berries of all types. The other high glycemic beverage is beer. Beer has a glycemic index of about 110 compared to sugar, which is 100. Now, I used the word glycemic index, and I didn't really explain that. Let me give you a little background on that. For decades, we've been telling diabetics to eat complex carbohydrates. Well, that was the wrong, and we've been telling people for weight loss to eat complex carbohydrates. That was the wrong thing to do, because many of the foods on this list you'll recognize as complex carbohydrates. Well, what we found out in the last 5 years or so is that many of these carbohydrates are digested so rapidly that they contribute to a strong, rapid rise in blood sugar, not much different from eating sugar. And the way they found this out was they took healthy fasting people, and they got up in the morning, and they fed them 50 grams of glucose. And they measured the rise and fall of blood sugar over time, and they plotted the curve. Then they measured the area under the curve, and they arbitrarily assigned that area the number 100 to start the index. The next day, they gave them 50 grams of baked potato, and they plotted the change in blood sugar over time and measured the area under that curve, and relative to the area that was measured for sugar, they assigned it a number relative to 100. So baked potato came out at about 85. Not too much different from sugar, complex carbohydrate. Next day, they measured white bread, 95. Okay, so they continued to do this until they virtually did all the carbohydrates. Broccoli, for example, 30. So tremendous health difference between eating broccoli, which, by the way, is loaded with vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants, versus a piece of bread. Both the same amount of calories, but a huge difference in what happens to your blood sugar, your insulin levels, your physiology, and the aging process. We now have an index of carbohydrates, glycemic index, measuring them from almost 0. Most of the better ones are around 20 to 40, up to even 120. Rice cakes, I mentioned earlier, 120 on the glycemic index. You're better off eating a bowl of sugar. Beer, 110 on the glycemic index. So, to the extent that you can eliminate these, and nobody's perfect, and we all cheat now and then, but the object of the game is to do this most of the time. And when you have a little excursion off this nutrition plan, it'll have much less effect on your lifespan if you do it rarely. But to nibble away at a little bit of some of these foods every day is a much bigger mistake. I'd rather see you be really good for a week and then have one evening where you take a break and enjoy some of these foods. But we don't want you limiting yourself to one of the foods and eating it every day, because it doesn't matter which one you eat, it's going to raise your sugar and insulin levels. Okay? Now, you're going to meet with our nutritionist in a few minutes, and she's going to go over a lot more detail and give you the glycemic indices of a bunch of different foods. But if you ever get tired of all the detail and you just want the most simplistic way of looking at it, this list of foods to avoid, I think, will come in handy for you.
I don't see peanuts on the list.
You don't, and if it's not on the list, it's okay. Peanuts are high in fat and they're high in protein, and they're relatively low in carbohydrates. So they're actually a very healthy food, primarily because the fat in peanuts, which is a monounsaturated fat, omega-9 fatty acid, are healthy fats. They actually help raise the HDL, or the good cholesterol. So peanuts are fine.
Well, I see all the things I can't eat. What can I eat?
Ah, good question, Tony. Basically, there are lots of foods left to eat. What we want you to focus on are things like fish, primarily, vegetables, meat, lean cuts of meat, primarily chicken and turkey, but you can have red meat. Just make sure it's well trimmed. And you want to limit red meat and cheese, which are relatively high in saturated fat, to about 4 or 5 servings a week, but you definitely don't have to eliminate them. Vegetables, nuts, vegetables, fruits, vegetables. Did I mention vegetables?